Good morning, everybody. If you're watching live, this is Sunday Morning Live with your host, Aaron Tomlinson. Streaming this on Facebook, YouTube, however you're watching, whether you're watching live or by replay, I want to welcome you. I'm going to do a few things as far as sharing the link on the New Day Global page, making sure that it's set to public and not to private on my current page. So give me just a second to do that before we jump into stuff here. I'm going to talk about the left-hand path some more, and going to look at Lilith, the story of Lilith. Some of you may or may not have heard of that or have any familiarity with that. But it should be fun, and I'm going to do it a little bit differently than I've done some of my previous videos, and I'll explain that in just a second. Again, just giving some people time to jump on so they're not just jumping in the middle. And sharing it to the New Day Global group. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody had a good New Year's and is ready for whatever else. All right, a couple people watching from YouTube jumping on, appreciate that. For some reason, when I did Friday's broadcast, if you watch the Friday show that I do with Derek Day called Freeology Friday, I wasn't able to see the comments coming in from Facebook, so I had to go check those out later. So we'll just see what happens. All right. So I'm going to do this a little bit differently. If you've been watching the last few videos, especially if you've been engaging, a lot of people have been just engaging in the comments and the discussion. Some of you have taken the liberty of private messaging me, which is fine. I appreciate that. But I love the engagement, the dialogue. I love how people are thinking about this stuff. A couple things I want to say. When I'm using the terms left-hand path, right-hand path, I'm using a term that comes really from the world of the occult. And again, I want to clarify for my Christian friends or adversaries that might be watching this. We have been misinformed as Christians. I can say this definitely. One of the things that we used to do was have what we call freedom weekends for new people coming in, and we would teach them about all the ways we thought you could get demonized and serve the devil and all that stuff. And of course, the occult was a phrase that we just threw around without really understanding what it means. So I want to at least clarify the way I'm using the term, the way I understand the term. The word occult simply means the study of that which is hidden. And it could be that which is hidden in terms of metaphysics. If you believe in a metaphysical worldview, in other words, you believe that there is a dimension or dimensions to reality that are outside of time and space, or that can't be observed, measured, and repeated by a scientific method, then anything that's involving angels, God, the spirit of God, demons, anything like that would fall under the heading of occult. So anybody that prays, anybody that worships, anybody that talks about having a relationship with Jesus is an occultist in the way that I'm using the term. But it can also be used for hidden knowledge. And so I'm borrowing the phrase or the distinctions of the left-hand path and the right-hand path from occult literature and occult thought. And I'm using it a little bit differently than they would use it for sure. But I wanted to just clarify a couple things and talk about this before we jump into the Lilith stuff. And I'm going to go ahead and do this episode in a way that I've never done an episode before. I'm going to do it in segments. Okay, it looks like I am seeing comments from Facebook, so that's cool. Joyce says, Grand Rising from Alabama. Shannon says, hey. A couple people say good morning from YouTube. So it's good to have everybody joining us. And again, I appreciate the comments. I'm going to try to follow them, trying to grow in this format, this platform, after how many years, 4 or 5, going on 5 years of doing this, to where I can read and respond to comments in real time a little bit more than I have in the past. So I'm working on that, also trying to keep my train of thought. But I'm going to do this a little bit differently, and then I'm going to do it in segments. I'm going to divide this up into segments. And I thought this might be helpful because I have a tendency to just shoot out a bunch of information all at once, and it can be difficult to digest. So I thought if I at least break it up into segments, then for those of you that are interested in really engaging and thinking deeply about the material and engaging it, you can watch a segment, maybe identify on the time frame where it's at, and then you can go back and rewatch various different segments rather than having to watch the whole thing to try to catch what I'm saying. So in my first segment, I'm going to talk just a little bit, reintroduce, or summarize and review, depending on whether or not you've seen my previous videos will depend on which one of those words applies to you. Where I talk about the difference between the left-hand path and the right-hand path. Again, this may be introduction. If you haven't seen the previous videos, if you've seen the previous videos and you're engaging with that stuff, this will be a bit of a review. And again, maybe a little nuance, a little clarification of what it is that I'm trying to say to make sure that I'm very clear in the way that I'm communicating so that I feel confident that the message that I'm trying to communicate is at least being understood in the way I'm trying to communicate it. So that'll be the first section. The second section, we'll talk about Lilith, and I'll give you some history on Lilith, who was Adam. Yeah, that Adam, the one from the Bible. Adam's first wife. Some people have heard of this, some people haven't. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to take that story, that myth, and we're going to look at how it relates to the concept of the left-hand path and the right-hand path, and that will be the third segment. Now, the reason this is new for me is because my oratory style comes up through preaching. For those of you that don't know, I was a pastor, I was a preacher for most of my life, and I learned a style, an oratory style, a style of preaching that came from Pentecostals. Pentecostals taught me how to preach a message, or how to communicate publicly, how to speak publicly. I didn't learn it. I did take speech class and all that stuff that I had to in my formal education, but I didn't follow any of those principles. I found them really restrictive. And one of the things that you'll find out about me as we go into this topic, and as you follow more content that I'm making, freedom is really important to me. It's one of my core values. It's one of my primary values. And I just didn't like the restrictions of the typical way of tell people what you're going to say it, and then tell them what you said, all the rules and stuff that makes for good oratory skills. I'm not down on it. I just found it restrictive. And so what is preaching from a Pentecostal style? So this would be the belief that the Holy Spirit is giving you direct utterance as you are speaking, that the Holy Spirit is essentially telling you what to say while you're speaking. So obviously, I was a pastor, I was a preacher, but I have deconstructed. I'm no longer in that vein. I no longer identify with any of those terms. I no longer am in the ministry, at least not in the traditional sense of having a church, definitely not pastoring anymore. Stepped away from all of that. Was my choice. Took myself out of all of those avenues for a myriad of reasons that I won't go into. But the idea was that you prepare, and that you study and you pray and you do all this stuff to get ready for the message that you're going to give, but you don't use notes. You just kind of spontaneously start talking, and you trust that the Holy Spirit is going to guide whatever you're saying. Now, we never said that we were infallible in what we said. just that the Holy Spirit was guiding what we said, not necessarily giving us a dictation. So word for word, what we're saying is the word of God. I never believed that. That's not the way I was taught. That's not the way I taught people or the way I practiced. But I did a very sort of free-flowing style, and I've just kept that style with my live videos and stuff like that. Now, I did realize that there were times when I wanted to teach on topics. I usually did this on Wednesday nights traditionally, and that would be more of a sequential teaching style. So if it was a sequential teaching style, then I might certainly have notes, I might hand out notes, and I would build more, let's make sure you got this principle or precept, and then before we move on to the next one. So that would be more of a teaching. So we would say if you did that style, you were teaching. If you did the free-flowing style, you were preaching. I preferred preaching to teaching, if those distinctions make sense. That's how I learned it from Pentecostals. So even when I have notes, I don't have pages of notes. I just have a few bullet points that I'm keeping in front of me on my computer screen in order to help me remember where I'm going, so that I cover all three of these segments. So I don't want to waste any more time with that. So let's just jump in and talk about the left-hand path. Again, I'm just going to briefly introduce or summarize this. If you want more information, or if you find this like, what's he talking about, then go back and watch some of my previous live videos that I've done the last couple of weeks, because that's where I've been focused. I think this is the third message that I've done in sequential order of the last 3 weeks on the left-hand path. Now, keep in mind, when I'm talking about path, left-hand path or right-hand path, the way I'm using the term is not literal. I'm not saying that you're on a path or on a journey literally. I'm using these terms as metaphors. The word path, I'm using the word path as a metaphor, and I'm using the term left-hand path or right-hand path simply as a description of someone's orientation, primary orientation, and or primary motivation in the way they are practicing spirituality, or if you don't believe in spirituality, just generally your philosophy of life. What is the primary orientation or motivation? And so to make it very simple, so it's not like you're on a path or going a direction per se. That's just a metaphor. So I don't want you to get hung up on that. The reason I'm highlighting this is because I don't want you to get hung up on, am I left-hand path or my right-hand path, or is there a middle path? Because to think about it in that way is to totally miss what I'm trying to say. I'm simply trying to identify the difference, I'll say it again, in orientation, motivation, in the way you approach or practice your philosophy of life, or for those of you that are spiritually inclined, almost every religion, almost every spiritual path is right-hand path oriented. So if you intuitively, even unconsciously, pull away from right-hand path, or some people have intuitively or unconsciously, or maybe even consciously, have pulled away from spirituality because they can only understand spirituality from the perspective of a right-hand path. So what I'm trying to do is provide an alternative to say you can have a spiritual practice, you can have a philosophy, even a metaphysics, even faith in God, and a strong faith in God and practice of that, but with a totally different orientation than what we were given in traditional religions and even alternative forms of spirituality as they are presented in the most popular podcasts and the most popular YouTube channels out there on the internet, talking about alternative forms of spirituality. And I know this because I looked up recently, what are the most popular podcasts? What are the most popular YouTube channels on spirituality? And almost all of them, in fact, all of them, as far as I could tell, without exception, had this right-hand sort of orientation. So the right-hand path, primarily, if you want to understand the distinction between the two, the right-hand path is primarily, not entirely. So I don't want people to look at the exception to the rule and say, well, then it's not right-hand path, because there's these few exceptions out here. But what is the primary driving force? What is the primary orientation or motivation? Is it externally oriented? And by externally oriented, I mean outside of our own internal processes of thinking, feeling, desiring, the self. Is it primarily externally motivated or oriented, either in the case of religion, towards a God that is external to us, a God in heaven, a God who is sitting on a throne, a creator who created us as a separate creation and entity from itself, himself, herself, however you want to understand that? Are you oriented towards uh, adapting and adjusting your life, specifically the self, to something that is external to you? Now, where this can come into play in alternative forms of spirituality, even though they may not, like religion, worship or serve a God that is external to them or other than them, they may be incorporating elements of mysticism that, or other religious paths that say we're on a path of return, that we were all part of the one God, the all that is. This is a Kabbalistic approach, and Kabbalah is definitely a right-hand path spirituality. Hermeticism is definitely a right-hand path spirituality or approach. And a lot of New Age stuff that has borrowed from Zen Buddhism and Hinduism and yoga and various different philosophies are also primarily right-hand path approaches. So anything that says I was part of the one at one point in time, and now I am separate from the one, and I'm living in an illusion of separation, and I need to bypass that illusion or lose that illusion of separation, and I need to completely lose myself back into the one. This is what they call the path of return. This is what they call ascending in Kabbalah, or this is what they call the path of return in Hermetic Kabbalah, etc. All right, I'm trying to get back to this place of oneness, and that requires that I sacrifice my individual sense of separation, which they call the ego. So that would still be right-hand path. The left-hand path is internally oriented or internally motivated. So you could, and the internal motivation is I want to fully experience and fully express myself in the best way possible. And I'll explain how this orientation makes a difference in our practical decisions in a second. But you could think about it this way, that the right is oriented towards the group. What is the group saying? What is the group believing? What is the guru telling me to do? What is the spiritual teacher or the spiritual leader saying is the way? In other words, the final authority on these issues is someone, some group, some person, some entity, some book, some tradition other than myself. So when there is conflict between what I think or want to do or believe and what the guru's saying, what the teacher's saying, what the book is saying, what the tradition is saying, or what even God is saying, then I'm the one that has to change. I will acquiesce and I will submit to that which is external to me and is being taught to me or being given to me. The left-hand path takes the exact opposite approach and says, I am going to explore within. I am not going to be defined from a source external, but I'm going to explore within and then allow my own definition and expression and experience of self to be expressed. So therefore, when there is conflict in an idea, in a value, in a behavior, between what is part of myself and what is with the group, the path, the tradition, the teaching, etc., I am going to favor and lean in towards myself. So I'm going to lean in more to my intuitive knowledge. I'm going to lean in more to my own preferences, my own values. I'm going to discover myself. I'm going to get to know myself, and I'm going to fully, in a much more expansive way, seek to express and actualize the self. So that's the way I'm using the terms. Now, you may understand, you may come from, I said I was borrowing these terms from the occult. You may come from an occult background and be watching this, and you may understand these things completely differently. And that's completely fine. I'm not interested in who's right or wrong. I'm just interested in helping us identify an orientation. And then I'm using left-hand path, right-hand path to talk about right-hand path being externally oriented, left-hand path being internally oriented. So if we think about this in terms of religion, there's essentially, I was thinking about this morning, there's essentially three types of people in the church, three types of people that are religious and deconstructing, or are still religious and still in it, or were religious and experienced religious trauma. But religious trauma can take place on three different levels based on, generally speaking, the three different types of people who belong to churches and who follow religion. So I'm going to be using, of course, as my frame of reference, Christianity, because that's what I know the best. That's what I was part of and converted into. That's what I came out of and deconstructed from and deconverted out of. So in the church, I'm going to label the first group as believers. These are people that are believers who are distinguished from other people simply by the fact that they believe. They believe in the Bible. They believe in God. They believe in Jesus. They believe in the atonement, etc., and so on. And that's about as far as they go with it. This group, you could also call them followers, adherents. We would, back in the day when I was preaching, we would call them casual Christians, Sunday go to meeting. It was all very derogatory. Casual Christians, Sunday go to meeting Christians, lukewarm Christians, etc., and so on. And I'm not trying to be derogatory or demeaning to people. I'm just identifying a class of people and what motivates them, either consciously or unconsciously. So believers or followers are trying to get God at the end of the day, if we're just brutally honest about it, they are trying to get God to do something for them. And they're operating on this sort of reward and punishment system. Now, this reward and punishment system could just be about death and life after death. So I want to believe in Jesus as my personal Savior. I want to accept him as my Lord and Savior. Maybe I want to get baptized. I want to receive the gift of salvation. I want to receive Christ into my life. I want to ask Jesus to come into my heart. But the end goal in mind is that when I die, I want to go to heaven and not to hell. And that may be all the farther anybody takes it. Other people might say, well, I want to enjoy my life here as well. So I want to learn how to have enough faith to get God to do something for me. So I want to have enough faith to be healed. I want to have enough faith to be blessed, whatever that blessing may be. Usually it's some kind of financial thing. I want a better job. I want a better relationship. It could be social as well. I want a better relationship. I want my kids to be following Christ. I want a better house to live in. I want a better standard of life or standard of living. I want to have something to lean into. I want to be able to lean into God when there's crisis or when there's tragedy that strikes. But it's all kind of based on this reward thing. If I can pray right, if I can live right, in the sense that I'm going to follow a certain moral code or behavioral standards. So if I'm believing right and I'm doing right, then I can be blessed by God. So at the end of the day, these values for this group tend to be oriented towards survival needs or survival of the self, or just like basic sort of material needs. Certainly the existential need to exist after death, to deal with that fear of death, very, very basic. That's why I believe and receive Jesus as my Lord and Savior. And then if I get a little bit more serious about it, I'm hoping I can learn to pray, like I said, and get God to do these things for me. That's the first group. And they're motivated generally towards sort of If you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of human need, they're on those bottom levels, which we all have to do. Bottom, there's no inferiority with that. We all have safety and security needs that we need fulfilled. And that's generally what's driving this. And that's how people are relating. And they get traumatized when it doesn't pay off, when it doesn't work out the way that it was supposed to work out. They didn't get the job. They didn't get healed. Someone that they loved died. An accident happened. Some kind of tragedy happened, something like that. So the expectations, it didn't work. And so I suffer with confusion and questions. And why do good things happen to bad people? No, it's not why do good things happen to bad people. Why do bad things happen to good people, etc. The second group I would call disciples. Disciples are, let's see, these are adherents that move into service. So in the first group, it's pretty much self-serving. The second group, I want to serve. I want to have some kind of ministry. I want to make some kind of contribution to the greater cause. I want to, so these are the people who are going to give more financially. They're going to give to causes. They're going to give to missions. They're going to cover all the bases of the first group. And in addition to that, I'm going to volunteer my time at the church, whether that's doing children's church work or helping with hospitality or helping to clean the sanctuary and the bathroom, whatever. I'm going to go out and feed the poor. I'm going to volunteer at the soup kitchen. I'm going to volunteer for hospital ministry, stuff like that. This is kind of a group that they have all the characteristics of the first group, the believers, but they add this sort of second. And the disciple wants to imitate. So it's this spectrum from I'm going to be more involved by giving more money, by attending more faithfully and regularly, and by finding a place to serve, usually within the church. And then there are those then that say, well, I also want to imitate Christ. See the outward orientation? This is why it's right-hand path, because it's outwardly oriented. So I'm going to imitate Christ. I'm going to be like Christ, right? And this tends to definitely, you're going to submit yourself on issues of faith and conduct to those who know. So that might be the pastor, that might be the people who wrote the Bible, some authority figure that lived a long time ago, maybe the early church fathers, maybe if you're Catholic, this is what the church teaches, this is what the Pope says. But I'm going to conform myself to what the group needs. And then also, if I take it deeper, I'm going to imitate Christ. So I want to be a kind and loving person. Usually this is how it goes. And I want to be like Jesus. So I might wear the bracelet. If you remember the bracelets from a long time ago, I haven't seen one around for a long time. So I'm trusting many of you in the audience know what I'm talking about. But the WWJD, what would Jesus do bracelet, sitting there thinking, what would Jesus do? See, it's not internally referencing. It's not what do I want in this situation? What is the right thing for me to do in this situation? What do I lean into or lean towards? But rather, regardless of any of that stuff that I've got going on inside of me, what would Jesus do? So forgiveness is a great example here, right? Jesus taught forgiveness in places in the Bible. So I may not want to forgive. I may have resentment. I may have bitterness. I may have a desire to get revenge or get back at that person. But Jesus tells me to forgive. So I'm going to let it go. I'm going to forgive that person. And I'm going to trust that that's the best way to go forward, even though everything inside me wants to choke them out. Just giving you examples, right-hand path. That does not mean left-hand path goes out and chokes them out. That's not what it means. So these are not one-to-one contrast here. And it's not a polarity. It's just a different way of thinking about things. And then finally, the third group that I would talk about, and I'm almost done with the first segment, is the martyr. The martyr. Now, we typically think of martyrs as someone who gives their life for the cause, literally, physically dies, rather than renounce their belief in the cause. So this is the ultimate sacrifice of the self. Now, you don't have to die to be a martyr. You're just a total sellout. This is a person who's willing to completely surrender the self in submission to the external controls of God and the group. So they will die for the cause, but they'll also completely orient their lives around what they believe to be the will of God or the will of the group. So this is a person who they do what they do out of a calling. So this is someone who might get into mission work, someone who might go into the ministry, someone who might they're going to let the will of God dictate all of their choices, who they marry, where they live, what job they take or don't take, how they dress, how they present themselves, the language that they use, the music that they listen to, whether or not they watch movies or what kind of movies. We watch movies, but we only watch PG movies, and we don't watch Disney because Disney is from the devil. See what I'm saying? Like, my desire, my whatever inspires me has nothing to do with it. It has to do with whether or not it's right or wrong, whether or not it's holy or unholy, whether or not it's godly or worldly. And I'm going to always make the godly choice, the right choice, the sanctified choice, the holy choice, and my whole life is going to be. So I'll experience humiliation. I'll experience physical death. Derek Day talked about when he was pastoring, he had a couple who lost their children in a child protective services issue. And they said that they gave up their children rather than renounce Christ. I imagine somewhere in there, what is that saying? Spare the rod, spoil the child. Probably came into play there somewhere, but he didn't talk about that. But that would be the martyr person. So that's a person who's totally sold out to this right-hand path and lets the group, God, whatever, completely consume them. And they're interested in 100% submission and 100% obedience. Totally sold out. Now, I'm going to give you 3 different types of orientations in the left-hand path. Just going to cover this briefly. Does that sort of make sense to you? So left-hand path would be the person, I want you to notice the internal orientation. I'll give you 3 different kinds of people. The first kind is the one who becomes awake. They become awake. And what do I mean by awake? They become aware that many of their internalized beliefs, many of their internalized thought patterns, many of their behaviors, many of their internalized values don't really originate from within them, but they come from the way they were raised, the things they were taught in family, the things they were taught in church, the things they were taught in society, and they made choices in order to fit in, to be accepted, to get their needs met, or as some kind of, if you get into the depth psychology of it, some kind of subconscious defense mechanism. So a person who becomes left-hand oriented, they wake up and realize, hey, wait a minute. Some of these beliefs, some of these values, some of these ingrained behaviors are actually harming and limiting me rather than empowering me towards expansion. And so therefore, I'm willing to give up the groupthink. I'm willing to give up the group idea. I'm willing to give up the group value. I'm willing to sacrifice relationship because I'm no longer going to betray myself with these beliefs and these behaviors. I'm no longer going to limit myself with these beliefs and these behaviors. And I'm not going to no longer harm myself or others with these beliefs and these behaviors. That's the person who becomes awakened. They just realize that this is what's going on here. Their motive is really for liberty. It's for wholeness. It's for freedom of self-expression. Then you have those, I would say, on the left-hand path who are illuminated, who have illumination. By that, I simply mean knowledge or the application of knowledge that will serve the self in the self's pursuit of wholeness or expression. Joseph Campbell defines the left-hand path as someone who pursues their own bliss, who no longer goes along with the crowd, goes along with the group, but is willing to break with the group in order to pursue their own bliss. So the first person is just aware of it. The second type of person is actually putting real practice and experiencing real sacrifice in terms of their social standing, reputation, whatever the case may be. And then again, these are not like one is better than the other. These are just descriptors, or it's not even to say one who's done something is further along on the path. These are just descriptors, no hierarchy here. And then there are those, I would say, that are actualized, who are really all about expanding the self. And if they believe in a metaphysical world, if they believe in a spiritual world, if they believe in a divine self or a higher self, then their practices and their orientation and their philosophy is all about giving expression to that divine self or to that higher self. All right. That's segment 1. Now I'm going to move into segment 2 and talk about Lilith. Who is Lilith? According to Jewish folklore, Lilith is Adam's first wife. Adam had a first wife? Why in the world would Jewish thinkers and Jewish believers, how would they even come up with this idea that Adam had a first wife? And why would they call this person Lilith? Why would they identify them with Lilith? So there's a couple different ways we could approach this. We could either approach where did the name Lilith come from? Because that's actually older than the Bible itself, older than the story of Adam and Eve, older than the story of the Garden of Eden. Now, some people say, well, the story of Garden of Eden was around with oral tradition forever. But when we find actual evidence, we find some tablet, some inscription, something written on a bowl or a vessel, and we date it by millennia. The name Lilith, or the idea of Lilith as a demon, something evil out there causing harm, predates Lucifer, a belief in Lucifer, Satan, any of the archangels, and predates the Adam and Eve story. So seems like it's going in that vein where the Lilith comes from. So just to talk about that first. So there were in Mesopotamia, in the Middle East, again, going back thousands of years BC or BCE, we find inscriptions, we find amulets, we find all kinds of stuff about either a entity. Let me see if I've got it here because I want to get it right. And I can't ever remember this name for some reason. Hold on. Yeah, Lamashtu. And then there is another concept in the ancient world of what they either call Lilus or lilies. Lilus or lilies. And the word Lilith in the Hebrew, which is in the Bible, we'll look at it in a minute, seems to come from Lilu or lily. And the Jewish tradition is a blending of Lamashtu and Lilu or lily. I feel like I'm back in Pentecost speaking in tongues. All right, so let's unpack this and break this down. So here's what let me put it to you this way. If you were to go back, let's say you could get in a time machine and you could transport back to 1000 BC, and you could find a group of magical practitioners, the local medicine person, the priestly class of any one of these groups of people. And if you were to talk to them about Yahweh, or the Lord, or to make it more modern for people that are lean more New Agey or Catholic or towards Kabbalah, that kind of thing. You could talk about the archangels, talk about the Archangel Michael, the Archangel Raphael, any of these entities that we talk about and that people work with in their spiritual practices today. And they would give you a blank stare. They would have absolutely no idea what you're even talking about, because these concepts are much more modern than that. These are not ancient names for ancient beings and entities and deities. They are not. So if you were to talk about Michael and Raphael and Uriel and even Yahweh, or if you were to talk about Lucifer and Satan, they wouldn't have a clue what you were talking about. But if you mentioned Lamashtu or Lilu or Lily and asked them about those, their face might just, the blood might just drain totally out of their face, and they may just become totally pale and horrified and terrified, and understand that you're talking about an evil spirit, an evil being, a demon. So in this sense, Lilith far predates the idea of Lucifer and a fall from heaven and angelic rebellion and all that stuff. We talked about that last week. So what were these? So I want you to think about this. So Lamashtu was an entity who afflicted people specifically by causing tragedy to strike in the family, specifically the children. Now, I want you to think about being an ancient person. When they were ancient people, they were experiencing the same hardships, the same tragedies, the same phenomena. They had the same basic needs, the same basic predispositions to love their children, love their family, raise a family. All that stuff was in them. And they had to deal with tragedy, whether it came in the form of famine, whether it came in the form of natural disasters, well, things like drought or tsunami floods or something like that. They had to, they lived in fear of these things. And I would imagine that something like SIDS was around. Certainly miscarriages was around. And they didn't have the same scientific natural understanding of things that we have today. So they had to come up with a cause and effect to try to protect themselves, to try to prevent these things from hitting them. So if a woman experienced a miscarriage, if a family lost a child to SIDS, if any tragedy struck a little one in the household, then all of those evil deeds were attributed to a demonic spirit whose purpose was to cause harm to the children, to cause harm to the family. And this was, what was it again? I don't know why I'm having such a hard time with it. Lamashtu was the demon, the entity that caused all of this. And then the Lilus or the lilies explained the phenomena. I'm just going to be blunt and frank. Explain the phenomenon of guys having a wet dream, specifically the guys, because these were considered to be succubus spirits. These were considered to be entities that would have sex with the men in their sleep and cause them to spill their seed. The belief was that if a woman died before she could marry, if she died a virgin, she died before she could have sex and before she could have children. And so as a ghost, she would become a night, an entity of the night, a spirit of the night that would haunt and prey upon men, specifically young men, by having sex with them. And in some traditions, even giving birth to demon children. Later, these two concepts become blended into one entity known as Lilith. All right? So if there was a miscarriage, it was Lilith. If there was, let's say you were married, you had a new bride, and you had an orgasm in your sleep, you had a wet dream that you were imagining having sex in this dream, or you were having sex in this dream. You might wake up and be horrified by that. The wife might be horrified by that. So this was also a night demon who preyed upon. So essentially, Lilith becomes the entity who preys upon sexuality, tempts young men, and kills their children, families' children. That's who Lilith was. Now, if you're a first or second century Jew, just like you came up with origin stories about how did humanity get here, how did we end up, why is childbirth so painful, why do we have to work for a living, why do we have to work for our food? So you come up with the story of Adam and Eve in the garden to explain human origins. Now keep in mind, because this is really hard for us to get through our heads, these were stories that they made up in order to explain origins, where they came from. Now, we can read those stories today, and we'll find this out with Lilith in a minute. We can read the story of Adam and Eve today and find incredible meaning and myth and truth in that story as it speaks to and applies to us today. And a lot of people have done that. A lot of people that watch this channel have done that, have written books and published books about that kind of stuff. But that wasn't the original intent or the purpose. The original intent and purpose of the story was to explain where we came from. So they also would have to explain Lilith, right? They'd have to explain these where did evil come from? And so they came up with these other stories. Now, why would they say that Lilith was Adam and Eve's, or I'm sorry, not Adam and Eve, Adam's first wife? Well, because ancient people, even though they didn't have the same access to the same types of knowledge that we have access to today. By that, I mean specifically understanding of the physical world, scientific knowledge, biology, evolution, all that stuff. They weren't stupid. And they wrestled with the texts. And there are actually two creation stories in the book of Genesis. I was going to take some time to go over this, but again, since I'm doing this in segments, I don't want you just drinking from a fire hose. But you could go read Genesis chapter 1, and you'll see that there's an order to creation. And you'll see that humanity collectively, male and female, was created at the same time. Absolutely true. In verse 26, God said, let us make man, of Genesis chapter 1, let us make mankind, humanity, plural, in our image and in our likeness, so they may rule over the fish of the sea, etc., and so on. Verse 27, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So they were created at the same time. Also, in the Genesis 1 creation story, they were created last. Humanity is created on the 6th day. So before that, if you read the text, God, and the English version uses the word God, God caused there to spring up from the earth all the vegetation. So that's on like what, day 3, I think, that God creates the vegetation. Vegetation springs up. So humanity is created after the animals, and humanity is created after the animals, after the beasts and the birds and the fish, and humanity is created after, for sure, vegetation that's growing on the land and in the ground. Very subtle difference when you get to Genesis chapter 2. No longer are we talking about God simply, but translations will say the Lord or the Lord God. The term Lord now is added. It's because it's a different word in the Hebrew from the word in Genesis chapter 1 for God. Totally different words in the Hebrew. But you'll notice that in the Genesis 2 creation story, verse 5 says, "Now no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up. For the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, because there was no one to work the ground." The King James says there was no man to till the earth. So in other words, without a human being to work the ground and till the ground, there was no need for God to send rain or for the earth to produce vegetation. Also, if you're familiar with the part of the story in Genesis 2 where God brings the animals to Adam to see what Adam will call them, the way we read that in the English and based on the English-speaking Western mind, we think only in terms of how we categorize our environment. What category do these things fit in? So in other words, all small, six-legged creatures that have their skeleton on the outside are part of this classification called spiders. So God brought Adam spiders and he said, those are spiders. And everything in the feline realm, whether it's a lion or a house cat, is feline or a cat, and then further categorization. And so that's what we see Adam doing. But in the Hebrew, that's not what it's saying. In the Hebrew, the word for call there literally means to bring into being or to create. So there's a creative process when read and understood from the Hebrew and the ancient Near Eastern perspective. There is a creative process that's happening when God is bringing the animals to Adam, and whatever he called them, that's what they were. That's what they became. So in the Genesis 2 story, especially in the original language, it's very clear that Adam comes first, then vegetation, then the animals. In the Genesis 1 story, Adam comes last. So people reading in the Genesis story, it's God creating. In the Genesis 2 story, it's the Lord God doing all of these things. And so people from ancient times, they recognize the contradictions in this story, more so than evangelical Christians are willing to embrace that there are contradictions or differences today. But they weren't unaware of those things. They weren't afraid of those things. That didn't challenge their faith or practice, but they wrestled with those things in the text. And so much later, there comes a story of Lilith, who was Adam's first wife. And what it says is that in Genesis 1:27, God created Adam and Lilith. This is the story, and you find this in extra biblical texts. Lilith is referenced in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Babylonian Talmud, later writings, 800 years CE, 1,000 years CE, etc. I'm just kind of blending it all together for you. So this was an ancient idea. And in one particular text called the Alphabet of Ben Sirah, what happens to Lilith? God creates them both at the same time. He creates them both in his own image. And they go to have sex. This is how it breaks down in the actual text, in the Alphabet of Sirah. They go to have sex for the first time. And they start arguing about who should be on top. And Adam wants to be on top because Adam wants to control Lilith. Adam thinks that being male makes him superior in all ways to the female. So Adam's going to be in control. Lilith says, no, I can be on top because I am equal. God created us equal. So it's very important. Lilith in the story, even the ancient story, was not trying. I got the piece of hair hanging out here that I didn't get pulled back, but whatever. It's driving me nuts when I see myself on the screen. So Adam wants control and dominance over Lilith. Lilith is not seeking control or dominance. She's just saying, we're created equal, so why can't I be on top? And this is all in the context of the first time they're going to have sex. In the story, it's actually kind of funny. And the argument becomes so intense that Lilith, in the story, utters the forbidden and hidden name of God. She utters the forbidden and hidden name of God. I'll come back to that in a second. And when she does, she like grows wings and she flies away and she leaves the Garden of Eden and she goes to the Red Sea. And so Adam goes to God and complains to God and says, this woman that thou gavest to be with me, she's left me. She's abandoned me. She's divorced me. I don't have a woman now. I don't have a partner now. And so God says, this is a problem. You'll see that both Adam and God are kind of assholes in the story, because God goes to these three angels and says, go tell Lilith that she needs to come back and submit to her husband, submit to Adam, and do it the right way. Or 100 of her children are going to die a day. So in other words, this God in the Bible was often into killing people's children as a form of punishment. 100 of her children will die every day. And so these angels go out into the seas of chaos, which has ancient meanings that I don't have time to get into. And they approach Lilith and they say, you need to come back to Adam. And she says, it's too late. I've already had sex with the demon god. I've already had sex with the demon god. And so they said, well, 100 of your children are going to die every day. And she says, well, then in revenge, I'm going to take human children from the womb. I'm going to take human children from by killing them. And she says, the male children shall be mine up to the 8th day, because the male child in Judaism was circumcised, I think, on the 8th day. So I have power over them up until the 8th day. And the women, the female children, I have power up until the 20th day, whatever. So they said, they make this negotiation and they say, if you see an amulet with the name of these three angels written on it, you'll pass over that house. You'll leave that house alone, much like the Passover blood. And there's lots I could go into. I really wanted to get into the Kabbalistic idea of Lilith and Samael. I'll do that in a later video, just in the private group, the New Day Global group, where I'll come back and talk about it because it fits with left-hand path stuff, where I come back and talk about this. But for the sake of time, I still got another segment to get into. So Lilith stays out there. Now she becomes this demon goddess, this demon being, this demon entity who's killing children, unless you have these amulets or these bowls or somewhere she sees the name of these three angels. So then God creates Adam, but this time, to make sure that we don't have the problem we had the first time, God is going to take take Eve from Adam's rib or from Adam's side and make Eve. So Eve is going to come out of Adam. Eve is going to be a part of Adam. Therefore, Eve is going to be subservient to Adam. She's going to be less than Adam. And then we have the whole patriarchal stuff going on. So that's where the story in the myth of Lilith comes from. Now, let's tie it together. So this is segment 3. For those of you keeping track, this is segment 3. Looking at Lilith as an example or a pattern or a type for a left-hand path approach to spirituality. Understanding, I am not affirming that any of this stuff historically happened or any of these stories are literally true. I don't believe there was a historical, literal Adam and Eve. So therefore, I certainly don't believe that there was a historical, literal Adam and Lilith. I think these were stories that were made up in order to explain various different phenomena. But how can we look at it today? So in 1972, there was I forget her name, and I don't have it in my notes, unfortunately. She was a Jewish woman who was also a feminist in the early 70s. And in 1972, she introduces in a magazine article, a feminist magazine article, and back into the social consciousness, our social consciousness, the concept of Lilith. And she takes this story and she reframes it. She gives it totally different meaning. And instead of Lilith being the example of all the evil that's out there, Lilith becomes a shining example of equality. Lilith becomes a shining example of equality. She wanted equality, equality of the sexes, equality of the woman and her right to choose. In other words, her right to choose sexual partners as she saw fit, rather than, because remember, in the patriarchal cultures, the ancient patriarchal cultures, and many cultures still today, marriages are arranged by the families, by the parents. The husband pays a dowry. Women are nothing more than property in agricultural society. The patriarchal society is a result of the age of agriculture. And so therefore, women were considered property because they're giving birth to the heirs. They're the ones that have to carry the children and give birth to the children. Joyce says Gloria Steinem. I'm assuming you're asking if that's the name of the woman. The source that I referenced, I think the lady's first name was Lisa. But again, it depends on your sources. The one that first introduced, if that's who you're talking about, that first introduced Lilith into the social consciousness of feminism. And so, yeah, so women were property. Husbands paid a dowry, right? They gave birth to the children who would become the heirs of the property. And property was a direct result of the agricultural age. So here's what I want you to see. Lilith, in the Jewish tradition, specifically in the Zohar, the Kabbalistic tradition, Lilith is demonized. Well, she was already demonized. They take a demon, a common concept of a demon who steals children and devours children, attach feminine identity to her and say, oh, she was Adam's first wife. And the way she became this horrible, twisted, destructive, much to be feared demon that must be warded off by the names of these angels is because she wanted equality with Adam. And so much so that she used the forbidden name of God. She dared to utter the forbidden name of God. So this is the oppression of the right-hand path. Absolutely the oppression of the right-hand path. This is religion, spirituality, and the concept of God being used in order to give it the ultimate authority, in order to prop up patriarchy and the idea of property and oppression, basically to maintain a social order for the rich, the wealthy, and the powerful. And to put fear inside of people and to demonize any woman who would seek any level of equality or sexual freedom or reproductive rights or reproductive freedom. See, these are ancient. When we're dealing with these political issues that come up about the right to choose or the right to life, these are not new things. These are ancient principalities and powers. These are ancient archetypes that have been set in place to oppress women and maintain this power structure of dominance that's all based 100% on economy. And then using God's name in the enforcing of that and the perpetuating of that in order to get people to succumb to it, to submit to it, and to buy into it, and for a woman specifically to know her place. It's no different today. They are still using religion to accomplish these same political and socioeconomic ends. And they are using guilt and obligation and demonization of anyone who thinks differently, anyone who goes differently, anyone who picks a different path. They are outside the light of God. They are outside the truth of God. They are outside the values of God. And so therefore they need to vote for our party. This is God's man. This is the one that God anointed. This is the one that God chose. We're the party that represents God. That party over there, they don't represent God. And anybody that gives voice for equality, anybody that champions human rights for social justice or for equality for women or for the races, subtly, very, very subtly, oh, they're out of order. Whether it's the extreme of, that group that wears white pointy hats and calls themselves Christians and has the extreme view that God divided the races or divided people by the color of their skin, and there's a hierarchy based on the color of the skin, and of course white people are at the top of that hierarchy. Or whether it's applied to the family, wives, you must submit to your husband, and so we use the Bible to get you to submit to the husband, even so much so that there are groups and preachers out in this last campaign cycle. You may or may not have known about it. And before anybody gives me any crap about being political, I'm not being political. And I went to the primary sources. I heard it from the horses' mouths that there were political rallies, big political rallies in the evangelical churches and prominent preachers who were advocating that women lose their right to vote. You heard that correctly. That's not propaganda. That's not something I took off CNN or MSNBC. I went to the primary sources. Now, those of you that are really into the cult are going to say, well, that was a deep fake. This is one of the problems. All I'm trying to point out is that these are ancient forces. These are ancient forces that we are getting caught up in and that we are getting swept up in because we're buying into the hive mind and we're buying into the group mind, or we're buying into, if you're familiar with reality transurfing, we're buying into the pendulums, ancient energy forces, ancient egregores, ancient archons, ancient principalities and powers that have been established and fed and nourished generation after generation to keep these systems of oppression in place. And Lilith would become a representative then of the quest for specifically the equality of the sexes, but it could be equality. And by equality, what I mean is the right of everyone, the recognition of everyone. Like I don't know if you realize it or not, but you may not realize this. You'd really have to be really deeply nerdy into history, or maybe even a history major in college to know this, because they don't teach this in school. But the ideas that were written down in the Declaration of Independence were not fresh ideas. They were not new ideas. They were what happened in the between America and Britain was simply the next chapter in a conflict, if you will, between the monarchs and essentially the lords, the property owners. So they're borrowing terminology. The battle was property owners should have every bit as much say as the kings, that the kings do not have divine right over the property owners, which was white European property owners. So it was white European property owners that wrote the Declaration of Independence and signed the Constitution. So the phrase, all men have been created equal and have certain unalienable rights, specifically the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was an idea that would have been understood in its day as only applying to property owners. It did not apply to women. That's why women did not have the right to vote. It did not apply to slaves. That's why slaves did not have the right to vote. And it didn't matter the color of your skin. If you were a slave, because there were white slaves, I'm not trying to in any way make a false equivalence, but or in any way take away from the plight of Black people in America, not in any way, shape, or form. I'm not using the historical facts in that way. I'm just saying, even if you were white, if you were a slave, you didn't have the right to vote. If you were a woman and you were white, you didn't have the right to vote. So equality from this perspective of Lilith as a pattern for the left-hand path, or a type or an archetype for the left-hand path, equality is simply the recognition, Joe got it right. It wasn't Lisa. Where did I get the name Lisa? You're right. Now that I see it, I recognize it. Joe Mashuda says Judith Plaskow was the woman who wrote the article in 1972 and introduced Lilith into consciousness as a champion for equality. So equality is not, listen, there will never be equality for all. There just won't. There just won't. There can't be. We're all different. We all have different life circumstances. Life is not fair. Life has never been fair. There has always been bad things that have happened to good people. There have always been injustices. So there's never going to be equality in that sense. But the recognition that every human being, regardless of their race, regardless of their socioeconomic standing, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their gender or their gender identification, has the right to equal existence, life, has the right to equal freedom, liberty, and has right in their own way to pursue happiness, as long as their pursuit of happiness does not infringe upon those three things of someone else. So that was the concept in the Declaration of Independence, but they weren't talking about this for everybody. They just meant for white landowners. That's historically true. That's a historical fact. Don't get mad at me. I didn't write the history. I'm just putting the facts out there. So Lilith as a type for the left-hand path, number one, she says, I'm equal to you. I can have sex on top if I want to. I'm equal to you. And then this last part I want to get into, and I'll be done. She used the name of God for godlike powers. She used the name of God. She uttered the unmentionable name of God in the garden, and she grew wings, or she was able to fly. Now she has supernatural powers. She flies out to the sea. The hidden name for God, the unutterable, the ineffable name of God, has always been the name that God spoke to Moses. Watch this. The name that God spoke to Moses at the burning bush. And I'll elaborate more on this aspect of it because I want to go deeper here. I'll do that in a video to the New Day Global Group. So if you haven't joined the New Day Global Group and you're interested in this, I'd recommend that you do that. The ineffable name, the forbidden name, the one that was forbidden to pronounce, was the name that God gave to Moses at the burning bush, which essentially translates to, I am that I am, or I am and I will be. Now, you can't utter that name because that name is forbidden to people on the right-hand path. Some of you will catch that, some of you won't. Some of you will get hung up on it, the technicalities of it. In other words, she says, I am and I will be. And when she does that, the assertion of the independent I am, the assertion of the independent being, I am. And that empowered her through her own will and her own independence and her own freedom to leave the garden and go somewhere else. I want equality. I'm going to rebel against oppression, and I'm going to recognize my own divinity, my own sovereignty, my own I am presence, my own core self, and I'm going to express it in the way that I see fit. And I will not submit to a higher name, a higher authority, be it a God outside of me or to Adam, my husband. And the right-hand path says that's evil. That's sinister. That's of the left. See? So Lilith, then, the way it's retold, the way it's reintroduced to us who live in this generation, who understand this society, who aren't looking for the cause and effect of miscarriages and SIDS and all these horrible things as originating in some evil demonic force that is also influencing rebellious women and Jezebel spirits, and is also influencing all this social disruption and telling you could be like God. So in the Zohar, it goes on later, and it says that, just to give you a few things, we'll talk about this more, like I said, in the group, but it goes on later, and in one story, I don't know if this is in the Zohar or not, but in one story, Lilith is having succubus sex with Adam and giving birth to demon children, and that's where your demons came from, not from the fall. She goes out and, gets with Samael, and then comes back and, but she also, according to the story, is the one who convinced the serpent to deceive Eve into eating from the tree. So from that perspective, then, it's not Lucifer, it's Lilith who's the liberator of, from the Gnostic perspective, it's Lilith who's the liberator of Adam and Eve, rather than Lucifer. And there are many other things that Lilith can represent, but those were the areas that I wanted to cover today. So hopefully you've enjoyed this. Hopefully this has some meaning for you. And yeah, we'll cover this some more. Let me know in the chat, let me know in the comments. And again, thank you for spending your time with me. I really appreciate it. Thank you for letting me talk about this. My primary goal in this is to say, hey, those of us that want to connect with our higher self and want to express, lay claim to our own divine nature, not just our divine rights, but our own divine nature. Those that want to express our core selves, those that want to find wholeness, those of us that want to rebel against certain things in society that don't fit for us, that does not make us somehow second-class citizens in the metaphysics of spirituality. That you can have a spiritual expression, a spiritual identity, and a spiritual identification, even if you're atheist, even if you're a scientific materialist. The philosophical precepts can still apply and still become a spiritual path for you. And we can have one that's every bit as valid. We don't have to accept the position outside the camp that we are somehow less than, that we are not equal to, that our belief system, that the expression, that the cultivation of a strong ego and the expression of a self and self-actualization can have every bit, can be every bit as spiritual as a martyr giving their life for Jesus, or a person practicing yoga trying to diminish and destroy the ego, or a person practicing Kabbalah and trying to ascend the path of return back into Kether, from Malkuth back into Kether, back into the Ein Sof Or. Only people probably studied Kabbalah will understand what I'm talking about. That we have a legitimate, that I'm trying to lend legitimacy to the spirituality that promotes the individual expression, the connection with the higher self, the expression of the full and greater self, and even the expression of the Christ within. You can still be a Christian and be on this path. All right. God bless you. Namaste. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Leave some comments, leave some feedback for me. If you haven't joined the New Day Global group, it's a Facebook private group. You can just type in New Day Global and it comes up. If you're watching on the YouTube channel, I believe the link is in my description, not the description of the video, but in my bio. Sorry, misspoke there. And as always, if you want to help us financially, you can do that by making a donation on PayPal. PayPal is all we got right now. I know we need to get with the program. Obviously, clearly, I'm not just doing this for money. I'm not keeping private content behind a paywall, but in a free Facebook group. But we do have to have money to be sustainable and to do some of the other stuff that we want to do. So if you want to make a donation, New Day Global, PayPal.me/New Day Global, and you can make a donation there. And every dollar, every dime, every penny is deeply appreciated. And we're grateful for all of it. So your time and all that you have given to me, I honor you for it. I honor the divine that is within you. Namaste. And I will be with you if you're part of the New Day Global group later on in the week when I get a chance.